Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Okay, so my name's Morag. I am the Director of Scottish Studies here at the International Institute of Genealogical Studies, and you can find us at genealogicalstudies.com. So we're going to go through again the story of Alexander Watson, and I've called this Follow the Money, and that's just because this is how it all started. So the client brief, everything starts with the client brief. The client came to me knowing that his direct ancestor was called William Watson, and that William's father was called Alexander Watson. He had this written in a family Bible. And he thought that William's mother was called was called Isabella, but he didn't have any evidence for this. Um, and he knew that Alexander Watson and another young son of his, who was also called Alexander, had been lost at sea on a boat called the Arran Castle. And that was a steam tug. The steam tug is the boat you can see in the picture there. It wasn't one of those really big ocean-going vessels, and it wasn't a small boat. It was a sort of small steam packet type boats that cruised up and down the coast of Scotland, between Scotland, Belfast, these kind of places, carrying cargo and that kind of thing. I mean, it wasn't a massive place. And he also knew that Alexander was probably fairly wealthy to be able to own these ships. He had more than one. He also had properties in Glasgow, which he rented out. And he also knew that his descendant William didn't have any of this money. So where did the money go? So follow the money. So what do we do when we start any project of this type? So we know you take what facts you've got and you try to put these together to make a tree and corroborate them. So the two main sites that we used were Scotland's People, which is where you get all the births, deaths, marriages in Scotland, and other websites like Ancestry, Find My Past, Family Search, and the British Newspaper Archive. So what from the client told me, we know that Alexander Watson had died in 1866 and that he was old enough to have a 12-year-old son who was also called Alexander, who'd also died in the same accident. And because of what my client knew, we knew that he had a son called William and that William's mother was potentially called Isabella. But Alexander, who was born in 1854, was the year before Scottish civil registration started, so we didn't have a birth record for him. And we couldn't find a death record for the older or the younger Alexander, partly because of the common name of Alexander Watson. There's loads of them. And the client had already shared with me an article that he'd found in the British Newspaper Archive about the disaster or the accident of the Arran Castle being lost at sea. So with the next starting point was, right, let's have a look and see if we can find another one. Anything else about the same thing. So this is the tree that I was talking about. So it gets really complicated. So in very brief terms, Alexander Watson was married twice. His first wife was Margaret MacArthur, and she was a Scot who had gone out to America in the 1830s and had married out there to someone called William Taylor, who I think was also Scottish. They'd got together in America and had several children in America, one of whom was Isabella. So Margaret MacArthur, her first husband died, and she came back to Scotland with her four children and decides that she's going to get married to Alexander Watson. And this is all before civil registration, so we couldn't track their records of their marriage in through the records. But there's no reason to suspect they weren't married. And then Margaret and Alexander together have a daughter called Elizabeth, and you can see her on the bottom right there in the pink. And she was born around 1847. 2 years after her daughter is born, Margaret as well died. So we've got Alexander here, who is now left with his daughter Elizabeth, who's just 2, and all of Margaret's children from her first marriage, and there's 4 of them, including Isabella. And this is where it starts to get a bit murky because Alexander, a few years later, decides he's going to get married again, and that his choice of wife is Isabella Taylor, who is his stepdaughter. This is not particularly accepted. So when he lives with all the children and his wife Isabella and Margaret and sorry, as Elizabeth, his daughter, for a few years before he dies in this accident in 1866. And the Alexander who died in the accident with him, you can see him on the bottom left there, Alexander Watson. And Alexander and Isabella had 3 more children together: Isabella, Margaret, and then William, who was the direct ancestor of my client. So after Alexander died, there was a court case between Elizabeth Watson, who was his legitimate daughter, and the children of Isabella Taylor, his second wife, who were also claiming that they had the right to inherit from Alexander Watson. What the court, Elizabeth was arguing that she was the legitimate daughter, her parents had been married, and that because Alexander Watson and Isabella Taylor were stepfather and stepdaughter, that even though there was no biological link between them, that rendered their marriage invalid and therefore their children illegitimate. And the court agreed with Elizabeth. They agreed that everybody knew that Isabella Taylor was the stepdaughter of Alexander Watson, and therefore she should have known that he was her stepfather and that a marriage between them would be invalid. So when you go back to the client and you tell him that this is what's happened, what was his response? And his response was exactly as was written: goodness gracious, beyond weird, flabbergasted, and that certainly explains where the money went. So when something like this happens, it's tempting to try and find the rest of the story. But it's also important to give the client a bit of space and to be able to say, right, okay, think about it, have a think, digest what I've told you, and come back to me if you want to hear anything else. And that's exactly what he did. And he did. He came back and he said, okay, so what about Elizabeth then? What happened to her? She got all the money. What happened to her? Where's all the money gone? So he asked me to put together a timeline using the same birth, death, marriage records, census records, looking at anything in the newspapers that we could find, property records, that kind of thing about Elizabeth. Bearing in mind that she was born in 1847, which was before civil registration, and that people don't always tell the truth in court or anywhere else for that matter. So we started to pull together a timeline for Elizabeth. And as I said, she was born around 1847, but this is before civil registration. And about 1849, her mother died. And we know that from the subsequent court case over the inheritance. And we did find them on the 1851 census. So we've got Alexander Watson here, who's 28. He's the head of the family. And the 4 children of his first wife, of Margaret, is Elizabeth Jane, Margaret, Isabella, and William. And they're listed as in-laws, but they're not really its stepchildren. So they're his stepchildren. And Elizabeth, who is the daughter. So they're all living together in the same house. And then they've got a servant with them, which again sort of says that they're quite an affluent family if they can afford to employ a servant. So then in 1855, Alexander Watson claims that he married his stepdaughter, Isabella Taylor. But there's no proof of that. No marriage record in Scotland, no marriage record in England that I could find. They may have married under false names, who knows? I think it was a lie because he knew straight away that if he said that the fact that he'd never married her, that his children would automatically be illegitimate. And then on the 1861 census, I couldn't find them. I don't know where they were. Potentially out of the country or elsewhere. And then in 1866, he was lost at sea. And in 1869, his daughter Elizabeth, who'd by now grown up, she got married to William Muir, who works as a clerk in a solicitor's office in Glasgow. And he appears in the court documents in 1871 when the court case was heard about the estate of Alexander Watson, which Elizabeth Guthrie Watson won. So then it starts to get weird again. And in a subsequent divorce action, we are told that in 1871, Elizabeth her husband leaves her. So he has given way to intemperate habits, which means he was habitually drunk. And later in 1871, which must have been after the court case, he came to the house and he told his wife that he was off to Australia and not coming back. And he didn't. He went off to Australia. He was in contact with some brothers, according to the court case, but never with Elizabeth. She didn't know where he was, apart from Australia. And that he'd also been stealing money from his employers to get there, which was probably why he didn't want to come back. So after that, Elizabeth is kind of left on her own in Glasgow, with no obvious means of earning income. As a married woman, it wouldn't have been appropriate for her to work at this time. So she's kind of stuck. And the rules were at that point that you had to wait 7 years after being abandoned to petition for divorce. And divorce was highly unusual. Women just did not petition for divorce. It cost an awful lot of money. And poor Elizabeth, the first time she goes to court and asks for divorce, Lord Craighill who's the judge, he doesn't think there's grounds to grant her divorce, despite the fact that her husband has been in Australia for 7 years without any contact. And then so she has to go back to court, and it's granted on appeal, that she is entitled to this divorce. And the following year, she starts a new life and marries Robert Sampson, who's a grocer, and has 3 children, Margaret, Williamina, and George, all born in Edinburgh. And we do have birth records for them because they're born after civil registration. So this seems like a new adventure for Elizabeth. She's happily married. She's got 3 children. She's living away from Glasgow. So happy ever after, right? No. So in 1884, which is the year after her third child is born, she was admitted for the first time to Peebles District Asylum as a mental health patient. We don't know exactly what's wrong with her. We would have to go and pull the records from the National Records in Edinburgh to find out exactly why. But so she was in hospital for a few weeks and then out again. And then partly the year later, after this could explain part of her distress. Her husband's company was not going well, and he was personally declared bankrupt, and he owed £301, which is about 500 US dollars, which is 3 years' wages for someone like Robert. A lot of money. And they lost their house. They had to sell their house to pay off his debts. This is all recorded in the Gazette, which is the British government official publication. And then the following year, after that, a couple of years later, their son Robert's born, their last child. And on the 1891 census, we find the family who are living in rented property in Lanark, which is just outside Glasgow, in much reduced circumstances. Robert working as a gardener, and they're no longer having their own house and servants. It's a tenanted property. And things just go from bad to worse for Elizabeth. The first and last entry on this list is not her. The other 4 are. So you can see that she was in Peebles and Midlothian District Asylum twice in 1884. Then she came out and had her son in and her husband was declared bankrupt. She goes back in 1893 to Royal Edinburgh Asylum, which is the big mental institution in the capital. And then 4 years later, she's admitted to Gartnavel, which is the big Victorian mental asylum in Glasgow, and she never comes out. She's in there for 13 years until 1910, when she dies in January. And you can see there it says Gartnavel Royal Lunatic Asylum. Now that's not language that we use anymore, but that's how it was termed there. She was 62. She died of bronchopneumonia and Bright's disease, which is a kidney infection. And there's some evidence that repeated kidney and urinary infections contribute to this confusion and upset, which could have been written off as mental illness. And whoever's completed her death certificate didn't know who her mother was. She was unable to give the details. So it's a really sad end to Elizabeth, who won her case. And there's lots of implications in this for people who are researching their family history. So first of all, the ethics of the whole thing. We always say to people to warn about potential skeletons in the closet. And how do you feel about uncovering things? Usually when I say that, I'm talking about illegitimacy, that kind of thing. I really didn't expect to discover that you're telling a client that his ancestor got his 15-year-old stepdaughter pregnant. Not nice news to hear, so you have to sort of deliver that a bit carefully. Looking at sources, always looking for corroboration. Civil registration documents, people do lie, and on censuses, and newspapers lie too, but if you put the two together, you usually get pretty close to the truth. And people tell fibs in court as well. Isabella persisted with the myth that she was married. Whether she truly believed that or not, she was 15. Um, who knows? But they lied. They kept up the pretense that they were married right the way through. And there's a lot to be said about attitudes to women and girls. The overriding feeling was that this was all Isabella's fault. Leave aside the fact that she was 15 and 8 months pregnant. You know, she should have known that he was her stepfather and not married him, even though he was in his 30s and considerably more influential than she was in the matter. And the same with Elizabeth Watson and her divorce. You know, she had to prove her husband had left her and gone to Australia, and it's hard to imagine what more proof of abandonment the courts could want, but that still wasn't good enough. She still wasn't classed as being properly abandoned. So that's kind of changed, but it's something that you have to bear in mind when you're looking at documents from this period. The Married Women's Property Act and its implications. So before 1882, women weren't allowed to own property in their own right, and when they got married, everything was passed to their husband. which is great when you've got a husband who is kind and looks after you and everything, not so much one who's a drunkard or who makes himself bankrupt. Divorce was vanishingly uncommon in Scotland, so it's really unusual to find it. And the whole issue around mental health and how we look after people who are just not very well, and we don't lock them up in asylums for 13 years anymore and just leave them to die there. So a really sad story of Isabella and Margaret and Elizabeth and all these people, and Alexander too. And it just goes to show that when you start researching a family, you just never know what you're going to uncover. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now, and if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask or comments they would like to make, I would be more than happy to take questions or comments. Okay, so if there's no questions or comments, I'm going to stop the recording there. Thanks for joining me. I'm Morag Piers, the Director of Scottish Studies for the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. And you can find us on genealogicalstudies.com. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.